Hello, and welcome to this narrated PowerPoint about conflict and interpersonal communication. My name is Jason Stone. I'm a professor of communication at OSU OKC. In this two-part series about conflict and interpersonal communication, we're going to cover quite a few different facets relating to conflict. In this first narrated PowerPoint, you're going to hear a story about my grandfather, a conflict that he found himself immersed in. We're going to go over a definition of conflict. We're going to talk about some of the principles of conflict and interpersonal communication, and we're going to talk about three types of conflict. That is my grandfather. That's Captain Eual Elwood Stone, and he was a flyer. He was a pilot in the Army Air Corps during World War II. He was distinguished in his service. He won the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters and the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was active in the European, African, and Middle Eastern campaigns, and they won 2 presidential unit citations, and he got 1 oak leaf cluster. With that, he was part of the 484th Bomber Group, which was mostly stationed in Italy, and they dropped all kinds of bombs on German factories, and he flew B-24s. He was a great pilot before the war started. In fact, he owned his own crop dusting service and had signed up to be part of the Royal Canadian Air Force when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So I'm very proud of my grandfather's military heritage. There's several stories about his time in the military that's been passed down, and I think one of them is a great story for contextualizing conflict and how conflict works inside of ourselves and how we engage in conflict with others. Not all conflicts are habituated to our intimate relationships with other individuals. We engage in conflict with superiors, with subordinates, with colleagues, with people at work, with friends, with acquaintances, with family members. We engage in conflict in a number of different spheres. So I'm going to tell a story about a superior-subordinate conflict that happened towards the end of World War II that involved my grandfather being asked to do something that he was not comfortable with. And there we have a number of different aircraft there. For the most part, these 3 right here were the ones that my grandfather knew how to fly and was a pilot for. And he mostly flew, these types of aircraft, these 2 right here, the B-17 and the B-24. So Grandpa flew 52 combat missions and 37 sortees. And at the end of the war, after he had flown his 52 missions, it was not uncommon for them to begin to cycle people home. He reached that milestone in March of 1945. For those of you who are familiar with the war, you know that right around that time is when the American troops invaded Germany, and they were beginning to kind of roll Germany back into its borders, and we're all marching on Berlin at that point. So he was transferred home, and it was really kind of odd. He went from, flying a mission and being shot at to being told that was it. He had reached his limit, and they were rotating him back home. He was told that he would not be rotating back home with the rest of the group, and that instead he was going to be sent to a different post, and that he would be briefed when he got there. And his commanding officer gave him a slip of paper and said, "Go get on that plane. It's on runway 2." So he went out and got on the plane, and he woke up in Nevada after a couple of refuelings and a couple of stops. They had, flown across the Atlantic and then kind of worked their way over to Nevada. And the next thing he knew, he was being briefed about how to fly the plane that was going to drop the atomic bomb. And he really didn't know why he was there. He just knew that they were having all kinds of, serious discussions and a lot of pomp and circumstance and a lot of secrecy. And the commanding officer wanted everyone to swear on the Bible that no matter what, they would not disclose any of the secrets if they were captured by the Japanese. And if they would not put their hand on the Bible and swear that oath to God and to country, right then and there, that they would just be, decommissioned and, kind of sent home. At that point, my grandfather really, kind of had a problem. He did not like to take oaths on the Bible, and he especially didn't like to take oaths that he thought he might not be able to keep. I just described a really, really intense moment of conflict in my grandfather's life, and he is now in a situation where he needs to engage in conflict. He needs to engage in conflict with his superior officer. And how he chooses to navigate all of that is a great teaching example for the rest of this chapter. So let's keep Grandpa Stone in mind, and let's think about him keeping his oath and wanting to be true to himself, and still trying to balance being loyal to his country, being actually brave, being perceived as brave or as not being a coward, and giving, to his country what's owed to it, and giving to his religion what he thinks he owes to that. So, according to our textbook, conflict happens when there's expressed disagreement between two or more parties who are interdependent and feel a shared need for resolution to whatever tension they find themselves engaged in. And as you recall from earlier in the course, we talked about Martin Buber, we talked about the concept of I-you and I-thou relationships, and how those are different from I-it relationships. I-it relationships are more impersonable. I-you and I-thou relationships are where we fully recognize that other person. And we have all kinds of I-yous and I-thous in our life, and it makes sense that we would have disagreements, or that we would find ourselves engaged in conflict with people who are I-yous and I-thous. That's where we're going to get expressed disagreement. And because we are interdependent with those other people that we view as I-yous and I-thous, we feel a shared need to resolve that conflict. First, important to note that conflict is completely natural in relationships. Conflict may be expressed overtly or covertly. You may be engaged in a conflict, but because the other person is choosing to be covert about the conflict, you may not be aware that you're actually engaged in a conflict. They may just be being passive aggressive to you. Social groups share the meaning of conflict behaviors, and whenever I read that line, or whenever I think about that principle of interpersonal communication, I always think about the scene from The Christmas Story, where the guy in the middle dares the guy with his tongue out to stick his wet tongue to the flagpole to see if it will stick, if it will freeze to it. And in that conflict, he kind of quote, engages in a breach of etiquette by skipping straight to the triple dog dare, from the double dog dare. And that's just really indicative of how conflict means, things to certain, groups. Oklahoma Gas and Electric, OG&E, has a organizational culture of line. And they say that things that are blaming, things that don't, value the customer are below the line, and things that, take charge, things that value the customer are above the line. So all of us have organizational constructs, all of us have organizational situations in which our conflicts with others are situated, and social groups tease out what the meaning of that conflict actually is. Conflict can be managed either well or it can be managed poorly. If people are inflexible, if people are not honest, and if people don't communicate well, then conflict is most certainly going to be managed poorly. Also important to note that conflict can be really good for individuals, and it can be good for relationships. If people are honest, if people are not scripted, if people are generous, if people value their relationships, then conflict can be really good. You can arrive at some tremendous innovations and some tremendous kind of movement forward for relationships. And you can both, kind of rise to higher levels of ethicality and functionality by engaging in conflict. So it's not always bad. You just have to understand the other person's personality before you choose which way you're going to, deal with that particular personality. That's why my grandfather's situation was so unique. He was in a conflict situation with a superior officer with whom he was unfamiliar. So there's three different types of conflict, and for the most part, those are lose-lose, win-lose, and win-win. And when we engage in win-lose conflict, we're hoping that we're going to be the victor in the conflict and that we're going to vanquish our opponent. We're going to vanquish the other person. And boxing is a really good, analogy for that. One side's going to win, the other side's going to lose. Lose-lose, we often see that in like revenge tales, and when we see a movie or a television program or something like that that's depicting a revenge scenario, that's going to be a lose-lose conflict. The one that comes to mind right now is 47 Ronin with Keanu Reeves. And I think that that's a really, really, good one. They start off on a quest for revenge, and they know that even if they do everything right, that the best outcome that they can hope for is to get revenge and be executed for their insolence. So that's a great example of lose-lose, sort of conflict. You may make things difficult on yourself just so you can see that other person suffer. Sometimes if you feel like there's no way that you can win the conflict, you're okay with lose-lose. It's fine if you lose, just so long as that other person doesn't prevail, just so long as you hurt that other person. Unfortunately, a lot of divorces, wind up being lose-lose, and they don't value the children. An example of a better, way for couples to separate would be win-win, and that's where both parties kind of get something out of that negotiation, or both parties get something out of that conflict. So if we're honest with the person that we perceive that we have conflict with, and we tell them, what our needs are and what we have to have from that situation, and what our non-negotiables are, then we can engage in a type of negotiation and a type of arrival at a mutually beneficial resolution to the conflict, and that's win-win conflict. So I'm quite certain that you're on the edge of your seat. You want to know what happened with my grandfather and the super top secret training that he had been asked to participate in. There's an actual picture of my grandfather. He is the second one from the left there, and that's Captain Eual Stone with a couple of his crewmates posing in front of the Vivacious Lady there, which was their B-24 at the time. That craft was later shot down over Germany while being escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen, but my grandfather was piloting actually a different plane that day and was not on the Vivacious Lady that day. So he managed to come out of that one okay, but I'm not really sure how that top secret training is going to do. Make sure that you tune in for part 2 so that you can see how it all resolved.